My story of calling the police on my own parents. I never thought I'd find myself dialing 911 with the intent of reporting my own parents. It was a situation that felt surreal even in the moment, as though I were watching myself from a distance, detached, half removed from reality. Growing up, I'd always been taught that family comes first, that there's a loyalty you owe to the people who raised you, who provided for you. But no one ever teaches you what to do when that loyalty conflicts with every other value you hold. No one prepares you for the moment when the people who were supposed to protect you, the people you were supposed to trust the most, become the very ones who put you in danger. To outsiders, we looked like a typical family. We lived in a quiet, suburban neighborhood, had the same brick house with the perfectly trimmed hedges as everyone else on the block. My parents, Stephen and Donna, were well liked. Stephen worked as a manager at a manufacturing plant, and Donna was a secretary at the local school. They were ordinary, reliable, dependable, at least. That's how everyone else saw them. But in the walls of that brick house, things were different. I always knew that something was off, that the tension that simmered beneath the surface wasn't normal. As a kid, it was like living with a constant static hum in the background, a low-level anxiety that I could never fully shake. Even in my most peaceful moments, I remember lying in bed at night, listening to the muffled arguments that seeped through the walls, the sound of glasses shattering against the floor, the slam of doors that seemed to reverberate through the entire house. My parents' arguments were a constant in my life, a regular fixture in our household. They were always on edge, always teetering on the edge of some invisible precipice. And as I got older, I realized that a lot of that tension was directed at me. I was the eldest child, the one who was supposed to set the example, the one who was expected to be perfect. But perfection was a standard I could never live up to, no matter how hard I tried. And the harder I tried, the worse it seemed to get. By the time I hit high school, the yelling had turned into something else. My father had a temper that flared up at the slightest provocation. I'd see it in his eyes, the way they'd narrow, the lines that creased his forehead as his jaw clenched tight, his fists balled at his sides. I learned to recognize the signs, to gauge his mood the moment he walked in the door, to anticipate his reactions and tiptoe around him as best I could. But it was like living in a minefield. One wrong step, one careless comment, and the explosion was inevitable. The first time he hit me, I was 14. I'd forgotten to do the dishes. A small, careless mistake. But to him, it was an unforgivable transgression. He grabbed me by the arm, yanked me toward the sink, and before I could even process what was happening, his hand came down hard across my face. The sting of it left me reeling, a shock of pain and humiliation that cut deep. But what hurt more was the look of satisfaction in his eyes, as though he'd finally put me in my place. My mother didn't say a word. She watched from the doorway, her arms crossed over her chest, her mouth set in a thin line. Later, when I confronted her about it, she told me that it was my fault, that I'd pushed him too far, that I should have known better. And so, I internalized the guilt, the shame, the sense that I was the problem, that I was the one who needed to change. By the time I graduated high school, the incidents had become a regular occurrence. My father's anger was a storm that I could never outrun, a constant threat that hung over me like a dark cloud. My mother, for her part, had perfected the art of looking the other way. She'd brush it off, minimize it, tell me that every family had its struggles, that I was lucky to have a roof over my head, that I needed to be grateful. And for a long time, I believed her. I believed that this was normal, that this was just the way things were. It wasn't until college that I began to understand the extent of the damage. I moved out the summer after graduation, left for a state university 3 hours away, and for the first time in my life, I felt a sense of freedom, a lightness that I hadn't even realized was possible. I made friends, got involved on campus, started to build a life that was mine, and in the process, I began to see just how toxic my home life had been. But distance didn't sever the bond entirely. My parents would call, checking in, demanding updates on my grades, my friends, my activities. They still held a sense of control over me, a subtle manipulation that kept me tethered to them even as I tried to break free. And every holiday, every break, I'd find myself back in that house, slipping back into the role of the obedient child, the one who knew when to keep quiet, when to stay out of sight. It was during one of those breaks A Christmas vacation. That everything finally came to a head. I was 22, home for the holidays, and the tension in the house was thicker than ever. My father had been drinking more than usual, his temper flaring up at the slightest provocation, and my mother was in one of her detached moods. Her eyes glazed over as she drifted through the house like a ghost. On Christmas Eve, there was a fight. It started over something trivial, a comment about the food, a remark that my father took as an insult, and within seconds, it had escalated into a full-blown argument. I tried to stay out of it, to retreat to my room, but my father turned on me, his voice sharp and venomous as he accused me of being disrespectful, of undermining him. I felt a familiar surge of fear, a tightening in my chest as I watched his fists clench, his face contorted with rage. And then, he lunged at me. I don't remember much of what happened next. It was a blur of noise and movement, a rush of adrenaline as I scrambled to defend myself, my arms raised to block the blows. I could hear my mother screaming, could feel the sting of his fists against my skin, the sharp pain that radiated through my body with each hit. And in that moment, something inside me snapped. The years of fear, the years of submission, the years of believing that this was normal, that this was my fault, it all came crashing down, replaced by a blinding, overwhelming anger. I broke free, stumbled toward the kitchen, and grabbed the phone. My hands were shaking, my vision blurred with tears as I dialed 911, the sound of my father's voice echoing in the background, a mix of rage and disbelief as he realized what I was doing. I could hear the dispatcher's voice on the other end, calm and steady, asking for my location, asking if I was safe. And for the first time in my life, I told the truth. The police arrived within minutes. They found me in the kitchen, bruised and shaken. My parents in the living room, their faces a mask of shock and betrayal. My father tried to explain it away, to insist that it was just a family disagreement, that I was overreacting. My mother stayed silent, her eyes downcast, her hands clenched at her sides. But the officers didn't listen. They took my statement, took photos of the bruises, asked questions that I barely had the strength to answer. And then, they took my father away in handcuffs, his protests falling on deaf ears as they led him out the door. The aftermath was a blur. I stayed with a friend for the rest of the break, too shaken to go back to the house, too overwhelmed by the reality of what had happened. My mother called me, leaving messages, pleading with me to drop the charges, to come home, to make things right. But I couldn't. I couldn't go back to that house, couldn't go back to the life that I'd finally escaped. In the months that followed, I cut ties with my parents. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when I questioned my decision, moments when the guilt and the shame threatened to pull me back. But I knew, deep down, that I'd made the right choice, that I'd finally taken control of my own life. Looking back, I realized that calling the cops on my parents was the hardest thing I've ever done, but it was also the bravest. It was a decision that forced me to confront the truth, to face the reality of my situation, and to finally break free from the cycle of abuse that had held me captive for so long. I still think about them sometimes, wonder if they ever truly understood the impact of their actions, if they ever felt any remorse. But I've come to accept that I may never get the answers I'm looking for, and I've learned to find peace in the life I've built for myself, a life that is free from fear, a life that is finally my own.